Matthew 22. Then the Pharisees went and plotted to entrap him in what he said. So they sent their disciples to him along with the Herodians, saying, "Teacher, we know that you are sincere and teach the way of God in accordance with truth, and show deference to no one, for you do not regard people with partiality. Tell us then what you think. Is it lawful to pay taxes to the emperor or not?" But Jesus, aware of their malice, said, "Why are you putting me to the test, you hypocrites? Show me the coin used for the tax." And they brought him the denarius. And then he said to them, "Whose head is this, and whose title?" And they answered, "The emperor's." And then he said to them, "Give therefore to the emperor the things that are the emperor's, and to God the things that are God's." When they heard this, they were amazed, and they left him and went away. So I'm basically a middle-class white guy. Yep. When I first came to this country, I settled in a middle-class little farming town called Zionsville, Indiana. 2,000 people just north of Indianapolis there. And it was basically white folk and middle-class values back in those days. And the only partiality that we showed was you were either a towner or a non-towner. You lived either in the town of 2,000 or you didn't live in the town. And that's pretty much the only partiality we showed. But, you know, we had our barriers. We were all pretty much white folk and living in the middle of Midwestern. And so then we moved to Chicago around the beginning of my high school. So all the way through junior high, I lived in Zionsville. And we moved to Elk Grove Village, which was pretty much a suburban white neighborhood. You know, it was just a white community, middle class pretty much, with middle class values. And our high school, Elk Grove High School, was, well, we had a few Hispanics and we had a few Jews. But you know, the only partiality that I remember was you were either Protestant or Catholic, and that's about it. And I was Episcopalian, which was like halfway between. So I went to St. Nicholas Episcopal Church in Elk Grove, and that's where I got confirmed. And it was there that I started to experience some diversity, because Father Matthews took us as the youth group down to a soup kitchen in Chicago. And that's where we got exposed to a variety of cultures and races and religions and social strata that we were not accustomed to out there in good old Elk Grove Village. And then, of course, I graduated from Elk Grove High School and went to Southern Illinois in Carbondale. And there, being a major university with 35,000 students, I was suddenly exposed to all types of people from all over the world. Talk about diversity of race and color and creed and social strata. I mean, it was there. And it was like the first time in my whole life that I was exposed to all this at one time. And I worked at Bourne's IGA food store, so I had to deal with all these people from all different types of backgrounds and parts of the world coming into the store, and I had to deal with them for the very first time. Think about that. And I ended up with a couple of roommates I've mentioned before. One was Puerto Rican, Victor Pagan. I mean, I thought I would never have a Puerto Rican roommate. And of course, the other one was Lenny DeClue, the born-again Christian, but he was from the streets of Chicago at one time, and one of the biggest drug dealers in Carbondale at one time. So I mean, talk about, you know, experiencing diversity for the very first time at SIU. That's kind of a major exposure. And so after Southern Illinois University, that's when I decided to go into ministry. And so I went to seminary out there in Philadelphia. and I got exposed to the Eastern Coast mentality of doing things. That whole East Coast mentality is different than the Midwestern. It was kind of like a cultural difference. And I was there in seminary and exposed to all different types of people coming to this seminary. And one of my best friends ended up being this big black guy named Mac Smith. I still correspond with him today. And we used to hang around together and walk around that campus. And, you know, here was this big black guy and this scrawny little white guy, but we were the best of friends. Another good friend of mine was Hal Humphreys. He was another huge white guy from a small little coal mining town called Prophetstown in Pennsylvania, if I remember right. But, you know, he was from like a different culture. And so I was being exposed again to all this diversity. And I did my field education for the first couple of years when I was in seminary in downtown Philadelphia in black churches under the tutelage of a white pastor named John Cochran, who was on the forefront of doing ministry, Lutheran ministry in these all-black churches. So there I was going down, you know, into these all-black areas doing ministry as a seminary student, exposed to culture and diversity and things that I had never been exposed to. And talk about culture shock. And so, as part of my education, if I remember right, I came back to Chicago for my clinical pastoral education, which is my CPE, which is a requirement. I did it at Lutheran General Hospital in Park Ridge. But even in that hospital setting, there I was exposed to all walks of life, dealing with all different types of difficulties, race, creed, color, because I was a chaplain and I had to minister to all different types of people, regardless of who they were. And also one of the summers, in addition to that one summer doing CPE, I did Christian ministry in the national parks, out in Yosemite National Park. Beautiful. And that was my first exposure to the West Coast mentality, which was totally different than the East Coast mentality and the Midwestern. It seems like it gets a little crazier as it goes west, you know, the land of fruits and nuts. But I was a dish dog, a dishwasher for 3 months in Upper Tuolumne Meadows for a lodge. And my roommate was this big African-American guy named Alfred. I always thought it was cool that this black guy was named Alfred White. But he had this big fro, and he was the cook, and I was his dish dog. And we would hang together, and one day we decided to go to Reno, which wasn't too far. And there we go, you know, just like Mac and I. Here was Alfred and me, you know, this big black guy and this scrawny little white kid walking the streets of Reno. But you know what? It made no difference to me. You know, he was a good friend, and we just hung together. And so after seminary, I went and spent a couple of years before I went to LCM at another congregation in Doylestown, Pennsylvania. And I worked with the youth group, and one of my helpers was this young man, Andy Koenig, and he had cerebral palsy. So, you know, he was kind of like unsteady, but what a nice guy. Good, just a great guy. And for some unknown reason, we as a youth group decided we wanted to travel all the way to Estes Park, Colorado for some sort of youth convention. Yeah, all the way from Philadelphia, 1,500 miles. Yeah. And Andy volunteered to drive 1,500 miles there and back in spite of his cerebral palsy. You know how hard it is to, what a beautiful job he did. Because he drove one car and I drove the other van, and just amazing. So that was my kind of like my first exposure to somebody with, you know, disability and the beauty of how you can work with people like that. And then of course I came to LCM in Carroll Stream, which was another white suburbia place, and you know, there I was at Lutheran Church of the Master. But within the first year of my being at Lutheran Church of the Master, we got a warning from Sister Rosemary. I've told you about this, who came and talked to our Carroll Street Ministerium and says, I'm going to be starting a food bank. And we all thought, well, this is DuPage County. We don't need a food bank. And she said, wait, you know, I'm predicting that you're going to be needing this food bank in the future. And her words came true. And so I started a food pantry that was dependent on her food bank called Bethlehem Center at Lutheran Church of the Master. And by the early 90s, DuPage County was radically changing. It was. You had a big influx of people from the inner city because the projects were coming down. You had all sorts of refugees coming into DuPage County. Its demographics were changing radically. And all of a sudden, that food pantry at Lutheran Church of the Master and our ministry changed. That walk-in ministry, we had people from all walks of life coming through those doors and needing some sort of help. You know, and homeless people. I remember when PADS was starting, they were putting PADS together. You know, so I had Bert, you know, who was a homeless guy that I dealt with for years. I remember one family, a Muslim family from Somalia, which is a godforsaken place to be. But this woman managed to bring her and her 4 kids to the United States, and she had lost her husband to some sort of brutal act back there. And here she was living in these little apartments down there at the corner of North Avenue and Gary down there. She invited me over for dinner and exposed me to all the different dietary things that they were, you know, accustomed to as Somalia refugees. I mean, it was tasty. It was spicy, so I enjoyed that. But again, you know, the exposure that I got with all that was going on through the pantry and the walk-in ministry, and I made it a point that Lutheran Church of the Master would have open doors. That's what I said. Not only would the doors be open, but we took the screens down so that any type of person could walk in, because you can always keep the screens up if you want. You know, so a few bugs did come in, I must admit, but that's the risk you take. But that was an amazing experience for me. And then, of course, I left LCM and went to North Shore, Glenview. Talk about a cultural exchange from middle-class Carol Stream to the North Shore mentality. But again, at St. Philip, we started all types of ministries from all types of people. And at first, the old guard was skeptical. But by the time I was there 4 or 5 years, they had bought into the fact that St. Philip had become a place of true ministry. Deborah can refer to that. I mean, we had all sorts of things going on for all different types of people, free ministries of all sorts. We had a meal kitchen. We had a clothes closet. We had people from all different types of backgrounds. We had 13 AA meetings going on with people coming from all different walks of life into that particular location. And, you know, that's where I met Jimmy, the Native American. That's where I met Carl, who I still talk to today, who was unable to walk. I mean, again, dealing with disabilities and things of that sort. All different types of people. And we also, when I was at St. Philip, we developed a ministry to go overseas, to do mission work overseas. And so that's where I got exposure to third world countries like Myanmar, which is a modern-day Burma, dealing with an orphanage, a Christian orphanage. I mean, so, you know, then I got semi-retired, and as a result of my exposure to all this, even in my semi-retirement, I decided to do substitute teaching in West Chicago. People say, why are you teaching in West Chicago? Well, it's all Hispanic, because it doesn't matter to me. You know, people are people. It didn't really bother me that much. I think maybe if I had not had the exposure to such diversity, maybe it would have bothered me, but it didn't. And, you know, now, and then I also taught chess in an all-Catholic school. And people, what are you doing in an all-Catholic school? Well, you know, it doesn't matter to me. And of course, at Jewel now, boy, talk about an exposure. I mean, Elk Grove's not the same Elk Grove it was back in the 60s. It is very diversified. At Jewel, I mean, you have all walks of life coming in, and part of my job is to you know, in retail, is to deal with all different walks of life and try to keep, you know, any sort of barriers out of the way as you're doing your work. So you may be asking yourself, Pastor Dawson, why are you doing this? Because, I often ask myself, would have my life been different if the gospel of Jesus Christ had never been part of my life? How would I be different? And I honestly feel that because of the gospel of Jesus Christ in my life, I have not allowed certain barriers to get in the way of dealing with people. Because we live in a very diversified world. We live in a very diversified culture. We are the melting pot of the world. That's the beauty of our country. And, I could have easily held on to my racial, cultural... when I was in Elk Grove or Zionsville, the only time that I would see somebody of a different color is when they would be delivering something, you know what I'm saying? And that's what I thought it was all about. And I'm not being facetious, but that's the truth. But, I could have easily held on to all those barriers, social, political, religious, racial barriers, and my life would have been a lot more truncated, I think. But because of the gospel of Jesus Christ, I know that I have been changed from the inside out, and not allowed those barriers to get the better of me. And I'm sure that you too, because of the gospel of Jesus Christ. Because in a sense, we're all page turners. We're all page turners. And what do I mean by that? I've been reading the Old Testament. And the Old Testament is all about barriers. Read it. It's all about racial, political, isn't that right? Social and religious barriers, and God enforcing those barriers. God bless Him. But that's what the whole Old Testament is about. And that's kind of in line with our human nature, to be more tribal. We're all kind of have tribal instincts and we want to just keep to our own. That's our basic instinct. But then you turn one page from the Old Testament to the New, and you see the Gospel of Matthew, and all of a sudden that same God who one page in that direction is enforcing and dictating all these barriers is suddenly saying, no, these barriers no longer matter. Isn't that true? Because right there in the first chapter of the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus proclaims the fact that there's a new kingdom at hand. And I'm quoting the prophet Isaiah, that the blind shall see, the lame shall walk, the deaf shall hear, the captive shall be set free. In other words, I'm here to break down barriers. And I'm not going to allow barriers to get in the way of God's grace anymore. Because the God that I represent now shows no favoritism and no partiality. He's not going to play the barrier game that is part of our initial, instinctive reaction. Think about that. Jesus was a barrier breaker. He didn't allow racial, religious, political, and social barriers to get in the way of God's grace flowing through him and out into the world. Because all of a sudden, God saw all of us in the same manner. He says, I show no partiality, I see no favoritism, for all of humanity falls short of my basic intentions and glory. Therefore, I will treat them equally and give them equal access to my grace. It's like a lawnmower, cutting the grass all the same. Isn't that right? And that's what God sees now. There's no higher and lower, but it's all the same. We all stand in need of God's grace equally. The same amount of blood, the same length of the cross, whatever. He shows no partiality. And so Jesus came in to a culture, into a society, into a presence that was built on rigid barriers, preaching the good news that these barriers no longer matter in God the Father's eyes. And of course, the general population kind of said, yeah, we kind of like that. because we're not in power. We could need that grace, but of course the religious and political leaders who had power and had that power based on the barriers didn't like the fact that Jesus was preaching that these barriers no longer matter because he was undercutting their power. And so what you see today's gospel is the attempt of these religious and political leaders to entrap Jesus, to create another barrier by just using that coin. But in his own fantastic way, Jesus doesn't buy into it. He just kind of gives them an answer where it doesn't really matter. He doesn't play the barrier game. And because of that, they felt threatened. And you know the rest of the story. They strung him up. And so, because of Jesus, my life was different. I could have easily allowed all those barriers, which in some way do still exist in me, because come on, let's be honest. But the gospel compels us at times not to let those barriers get in the way of treating people in a way that God intended us to treat them. And I think that's especially important today. It just seems like there's a lot of pressure today from what we read and see and to create racial, isn't that right? Religious, come on, all you got to do is watch the news. Political, isn't that right? And social barriers. It just seems to be pressurizing us today. And I could easily stand in front of you today and preach about political barriers or social barriers, but I'm not, because that's not the gospel. We're called to not allow those things to hopefully get the better of us and separate us. We're called to move beyond those things just like Jesus did. And sometimes it's not easy. You have to keep your mouth shut. You have to keep from typing something or texting something that maybe you shouldn't text. Okay? Because it doesn't accomplish anything. And I mean, again, you have the freedom to do what you want, but as long as, you know, whatever. So let us pray. Lord, we just thank you for Jesus being a barrier breaker. And I was going to say that I should call him B squared. That's my term of endearment for Ray Beebe. BB, B squared. So Jesus is a barrier breaker. He's a B squared person. I'll have to tell Ray that tonight. But anyway, we just thank you for Jesus and the fact that he broke down barriers and that we still today have that power within us as a result of what you did through Christ to not let those barriers get the better of us in this world we live in.